When you're building a PC for a specific game rather than a general PC build, sometimes you should make slightly different component choices and priorities, and that's absolutely the case for Battlefield 6. I've had a number of comments on all my videos testing out the game, asking about what would I recommend if they wanted to build a new PC specifically targeting this game. And so here's my thoughts. Number one is that it's way easier to become CPU limited in Battlefield 6 compared to the typical game. For one thing, it's actually fairly light on the GPU as modern games go, but the CPU has a lot to do with the high player counts, lots of physics, etc. So for example, even if you had the money to get a 5090, but you'd maybe have to cut down from the highest end CPU to fit that into the build, you probably actually shouldn't do that, because if you pair the highest end GPU and CPU on the market, the 5090 and the 9800X3D, the 9800X3D quickly becomes the limiting factor. Even playing at 4K ultra settings, just going to DLSS quality on my 5090, quickly saw the 5090 being underutilized and hitting frame rates that are actually the limits of the CPU, confirmed by turning down to more aggressive, resolution scaling settings like even performance mode, and noticing that performance really didn't change. We were getting about the same performance, and the GPU is even less utilized. So again, very important to focus on the CPU in this build, whereas in many other builds, if it's more a general recommendation, I might do a, not low end, but lower end CPU in order to fit in a bigger GPU. Now, I'm also going to target a number of price points. So for the high-end build, we're going to look at a 9800X3D, as that is the fastest gaming CPU for this game. This was confirmed by a lot of testing. I think Hardware Unboxed had the most scientific results, where they were taking two PCs in the exact same match, not just the same map in the same location at the same settings, but literally two PCs running in the same match of the game. And there's a lot of variables that can affect CPU performance, and did the 9800X3D up against a number of processors and did confirm that it did come out on top as the fastest CPU. That doesn't mean you have to get a 9800X3D to play Battlefield 6, but when we're targeting my highest end build in this video, we'll do a few price points. We're certainly going to prioritize getting the 9800X3D in there. Now, then the question really comes in, how much can you cut down the GPU and still be able to fully utilize the 9800X3D? So if like the 9800X3D is hitting the ceiling on performance, there's literally nothing you can do to get better performance than the 9800X3D does in this game. How good of a GPU do you need to be able to match that and reach that? Well, part of that depends on what graphic settings you're choosing to play at. Now, for me, when I'm playing a competitive online game, I'm going to be willing to turn down graphic settings to chase the highest levels of performance. And so in my testing, I did test out cards like the 5070 Ti and 9070 XT on Battlefield 6 paired with a 9800X3D. And I noticed that at 1440p, which I think would be a popular choice for a high-end build right now, but still playing competitive stuff rather than just like single-player AAA, the 5070 Ti could generally reach the CPU limits. For example, on the Liberation Peak map, if I was playing at 1440p low settings with DLSS at performance, now newer DLSS models actually still look quite good at those settings, and the low settings in this game also still look quite good. In other words, I'm trying to push frame rates as high as I can. We can see that the GPU is only reaching around 90% utilization, not drawing its full power, indicating that we are actually running into CPU limits. So in other words, a 5070 Ti, when played at certain graphic settings on a 1440p display, can actually essentially max out the performance of the 9800X3D. Now, the 9070 XT would also be a reasonable choice from AMD, and actually due to less driver overhead could potentially get even higher frame rates, but we're talking, not drastically so, but somewhat so. When CPU limited. However, the beta didn't have FSR4 support. Perhaps the actual game will, but I'm relying here on aggressive upscaling to reach these super high frame rates. And so, knowing for sure that we have good versions of DLSS in the game is important for my recommendation, since we don't know for sure that FSR4 will be in the game. And now, hopefully it will be. But since I don't know that for sure, I'm not going to recommend that over the 5070 Ti when they're actually similar price points. So if we go to my $1,800 build, I basically think that for about $1,800, you can essentially max out the game's performance for competitive settings on a 1440p display. You can, the 9800X3D sets the absolute limits of the performance that you're able to get, and as long as you have a graphics card that can get there, it's going to be the highest performance you can get in the game. So with that being said, I slotted together a PC part picker build where there's still some wiggle room to save a bit of money, but I think that overall, this is pretty reasonable. We're spending a ton of money on the CPU because, like I said, we're trying to just absolutely max out the performance in this game. So the 9800X3D is currently coming in at about $472. And then I've thrown a CPU cooler on here, which I'm going to be honest, could be cut back a bit. You don't actually need much to cool a 9800X3D. So if we need to cut some budget, we could actually cut down to a cheap air cooler. But the Arctic Liquid Freezer 3 Pro 360 millimeter AIO, I went with the black version rather than spending like $5 or $10 more on the RGB version. Overall, my PC build theme here is kind of a black professional looking box with a little RGB on the case fans, but you could turn that off. Anyway, I prefer a more sleek black box look. I know some people like all the flashing lights. Anyway, for the motherboard, I went with a B850M with Wi-Fi 7. This being $30 off right now at Newegg actually made it a pretty good choice. Because we're not spending much more. Again, they have a promo code right now. This isn't costing a lot more than the older B650 boards, but it does come with some nice to have features like Wi-Fi 7, 5G LAN, etc. So one thing is, especially if you were going to be playing this game not plugged in directly, but relying on Wi-Fi, having built-in Wi-Fi 7 certainly seems like it would help out in a competitive type situation. Obviously, ideally, you would be LAN connected, but I know not everybody's able to plug in an Ethernet port directly to their modem, depending on their house layout, etc. So anyway, there's that motherboard choice. For memory, on the 9800X3D, going with DDR5 6000 CL30 memory tends to be the sweet spot, and this was simply the least expensive model available on PC Part Picker at this point. And it's nice and black, so it kind of fits the black aesthetic here. I went with a 2 terabyte SSD. It was one of the least expensive PCIe 4.0 2 terabyte SSDs, and you wouldn't save much more money by going with the slower drive. So I went with this one. And again, you could cut back to like 1 terabyte if you need to save some money on the build. But this is, I really honestly, with how big game installs are right now, I think it's pretty inconvenient to have less than 2 terabytes if you want to have multiple games installed on the PC at the same time. Now for the graphics card, I already explained why I chose a 5070 Ti. They're also currently available at MSRP of $750, and fitting the kind of sleek build idea, we have the Asus Prime model, which I actually think looks like one of the more professional looking cards. Again, this coming in with mostly black, not a lot of RGB, looks pretty sleek. And most importantly, it hits its MSRP of $750, which is pretty nice to see. Now, I want to be clear that the case is pretty much a placeholder. You could find stuff, you could save another $20 or $30 on the case if you want to buy the cheapest thing available, or you could easily spend hundreds of dollars more if you want something super flashy. For me, from a value perspective, the important thing on the case is that if it comes with case fans, it's going to be better deal than buying case fans separately, because they're going to be able to bundle in those on these massive bulk purchases, whereas you're buying them separately. This comes with 340 millimeter ARGB fans, which again, I'm kind of going for the black box look, but I'm pretty certain you could turn off the RGB if you don't want it right there, or leave it on if you do want that. And then 140 millimeter non-ARGB PWM fan installed in the back, all pre-installed. So for, again, the 9800X3D being pretty energy efficient means that this overall build doesn't actually need a massive amount of cooling, and this should cover all of it. And then the power supply, you do want a solid power supply here, especially if you wanted to upgrade in the future to something that was more power hungry. And I actually thought this was an amazing deal. Usually getting an 850 watt high tier, but judging by tier list, this is an A- tier. This is really solid. This has not only the gold, 80 plus gold standard rating, but also the Cybernetics Platinum rating, 10-year warranty, highly rated on PSU tier lists. Again, I saw A- tier, which is very solid. This is the ATX 3.1, which means that you do have the native cables to connect to the GPU with the 12V 2x6 cable, etc. Anyway, seemed like a really solid deal on that. So that should power everything here, plus upgrades in the future. And pretty solid build. We come in right at $1,800 on this, and I think that this can do everything that you want it to. Like I mentioned though, we've got some lower priced builds if this is just well beyond your budget. However, I sometimes have people ask me what monitor they should include. And I'll be honest, I usually avoid that because it's really a separate topic. However, I do think it would be important to get at least a 240 hertz monitor to match this build, or else you're kind of wasting it. Now, you might already have a 1440p 240 hertz display. But if you don't, I think that would make sense in this build. Now, a lot of people haven't realized just how inexpensive those kind of specs have gotten. Let me set it to 240 hertz here. So let's go for a minimum of 240 hertz on a 1440p display. Now, obviously not every monitor is created equal from an image quality standpoint, etc. But you can get 240 hertz 1440p displays that are IPS as low as $166. Some of these models being a little better than others. I believe these Acers are reviewed at least reasonably okay. Coming in right at about $200 for that spec. Now, personally, everybody knows, well, if you watch my channel for a while anyway, that I am definitely an OLED fan. And OLEDs are going to cost more, but they also have incredible response times and motion clarity. In addition to this game really does pop, with OLED, black levels and everything like that. So if you did want to search for an OLED with these specs, I did some research here, and I will say that an OLED 1440p display that is at least 240 hertz. What's just say? I feel like the search parameters here are not quite. Man, I saw better options yesterday. I don't know what's going on with my search parameters here. Let's just go OLED. 240 hertz, did that free something up? Man, I thought I saw some good options around $500. Let me actually go back to this link that I had made that had a monitor set into it. Okay, yeah, I don't know why my filters weren't going for it here, but it is available here. At $550, you can actually get a 280 hertz newer, it's new, but this one actually came out very recently. It's a new model. Dell Alienware model, very highly reviewed, 1440p 280 hertz OLED. That would be a pretty amazing monitor to pair with this, but again, you might already have a monitor that gets the job done. Anyway, there is the build. Now, what if you don't have that much money? So I already hinted at some places that we could cut some things back. So one place that we could cut things back is the actual CPU itself, though. So the 7800X3D is actually currently over $100 less expensive than the 9800X3D. And while the 9800X3D is the fastest CPU on the market, fastest CPU in this game, if you actually look at reviews of the 9800X3D up against the 7800X3D, and this is like a meta-analysis of a bunch of review outlets, on average, it reaches almost 90%, the 7800X3D reaches almost 90% of the performance of the 9800X3D. So there's not a huge performance gap there. Some outlets had it reaching closer to 85% of the performance, so potentially in certain games, and I didn't find a really nice head-to-head between the two in Battlefield 6, but we're talking, 10 to 15% slower than the 9800X3D, which isn't massive, but does shave a good chunk of money off of the build. Also, we can take that air cooler, which was, $85, and pair it back to a to take the AIO cooler, which is $85, pair it back to a cheap air cooler, and honestly, the Thermalright Peerless Assassin can completely cool a 7800X3D. The 9800X3D and the 7800X3D don't draw a lot of power. That's one of the advantages of throwing these in your build compared to one of the really power-hungry Intel high-end chips. Anyway, so something to note there. It's actually pretty easy to cool. And then we could pair back the motherboard. I liked getting the B850 that had Wi-Fi 7 and I think, had the PCI 5.0 slot, all of that, but you can shave, another $30 off the build going with like a B650, which I've got slotted in here. Kept the same memory because still 32 gigabytes of DDR5, 6000 CL30, I still think is kind of the sweet spot there from price to performance. And then I took the same SSD, but I cut it back to 1 terabyte instead of 2 terabytes, shaving another like $40 or $50 off of the build. I left in the 5070 Ti for now because I still think that the 5070 Ti and the 7800X3D make a pretty good pairing where they're, again, if you're playing at more aggressive graphics settings, the 5070 Ti should be able to kind of reach what the 7800X3D can do. And this should pair pretty nicely for maximum performance in this game. I left in the same case. Again, there's cheaper cases there, if you want to go down into the $40, $50 range. I liked that this came with a bunch of fans and had reasonable reviews. And again, this power supply, I really think is a great deal at $90 for all the specs that you're getting, so I don't really want to cut that down too much more anyway. All right, so that brings us in at about $1,570. So this cuts it back a bit more, and I understand this is still very expensive. And again, same thoughts on the monitors. I'd recommend a 240 hertz or more display. And I think going 1440p route and using DLSS to upscale to that is going to be a better choice than going the 1080p route playing at native. You'll still get more detail at 1440p upscaled from resolutions below 1080p than you would playing at native 1080p on the 1080p display. Anyway, but what if you still can't hit this price point? Well, I did prepare one more build that cuts things back a bit further. This is coming in right around $1,200. It was $1,190 last night, but apparently a couple of parts have adjusted in price slightly since I put the initial list together last night. But here we have to take a sacrifice on the CPU side of things and the GPU side of things if we're going to save much money. So basically here I went down to a Ryzen 5 9600X as opposed to the 7800X3D. This is a bit of a painful cut to make given how CPU demanding this game is, but again, not everybody's made of money. We might need to make some cuts somewhere. And if we're cutting back the GPU as well anyway, then it's possible that we would not be hitting, we wouldn't be able to max out the 7800X3D necessarily anyway. So you might not actually feel the cut if you're cutting both the CPU and the GPU at the same time. This could still probably be a pretty reasonable pairing. So the CPU here, Ryzen 5 9600X, that saves us, over $150 off the build. I'm keeping the air cooler, keeping the less expensive motherboard, keeping the same memory, the same 1 terabyte hard drive, and the video card is dropping from a 5070 Ti down to a 5070. This is saving $200 on the build itself right there. And the fact that we're going down to 12 gigabytes of VRAM doesn't seem to be an issue in Battlefield 6 specifically. So if we're targeting Battlefield 6, having 12 gigabytes of VRAM isn't a big deal. You could go with the AMD 9070 here. Would also be a reasonable choice, but that is $50 more expensive. And again, I'm hesitant until I see whether FSR4 is for sure in the final build. Was also nice for the build aesthetics to still be mostly going with a kind of a black build here, and I still found the Asus Prime model, which I think is a sleek black look for the build at the MSRP of $550. So not paying any extras for the aesthetics. Same case with the Montech Air 903 Max, coming with the coolers and all that. And I'm still keeping this power supply. I think for $90, this is, there's certain components to your build that you could use for years to come, and a high quality power supply is one of them. So again, the fact that this is A- tier and highly rated on Cybernetics and 80 plus gold and 850 watts is pretty solid for most reasonable, even higher end builds. I think is pretty cool. So yeah, that comes in right at $1,200. Now, can you play this game on less expensive stuff? Absolutely, you totally can. But for the purposes of today's video, those were the 3 price points that I prepared. High end, that's basically going to be the maximum performance you can possibly get in the game. Cutting a few $100s off the build without sacrificing almost any noticeable actual performance in the game. And then cutting a few $100s more where you will notice some performance off in the game compared to the super higher end stuff, but not majorly so, and you'll still be getting great performance in the game overall. One thought here is if you want kind of an in-between option, you could keep the 5070 and go back up to the 7800X 3D. Just because of how CPU bound the game can be. So that would be, I think, a reasonable thing to do kind of in between here. Lower than this, and you're going to have to start making a lot of compromises. So again, if you're building a brand new build, I think these were some good options if you're trying to max out performance in the game. If you already have a reasonable PC build, if you're on an older platform like AM4 or something like that, I will say that in hardware unbox testing, the 5800X 3D didn't do too bad of a job here. Certainly, the 9800X 3D is noticeably faster, but the 5800X 3D put up a pretty dang good fight. So if you're on an older AM4 build, maybe looking into if you have a 5800X 3D, or if you can find like a used 5700X 3D, 5800X 3D, something like that, that might be a pretty reasonable way to go as well. All right, I can hear my kids waking up and starting to stomp on down the stairs. So we're going to end the build video there for today. Hope you guys found it useful and or interesting. If you want to support the channel, there's always the join button down below. And huge thank you to viewers, commenters, subscribers. All of you, you're all beautiful people, and I hope you have an excellent day.